Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Appalachia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments from where you are watching and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the spring of 1858, a small settlement nestled in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains became the stage for what many historians would later call the most methodical act of retribution ever documented in Appalachian history. The body of Noah Briggs was discovered at the bottom of an abandoned mine shaft on his property, some 17 miles northeast of Boone, North Carolina. 3 days later, the remains of Daniel Carter were found in the same shaft, their limbs entangled in a macabre final embrace. What made this discovery particularly disturbing was not merely the state of the bodies, but the elaborate mechanism that had sealed both men's fate, a system of counterweights, pulleys, and tripwires that investigators could only describe as a work of terrible genius. The case might have been forgotten entirely, relegated to courthouse archives and local folklore, had it not been for a series of journals discovered during renovations to the old Watauga County Courthouse in 1964. These journals, written by Ezekiel Freeman, the last surviving slave owned by the Briggs-Carter household, detailed not only the conditions of his captivity, but the methodical planning that went into what some would call an escape, and others a perfect crime. The words inscribed in those weather-beaten pages transformed what seemed to be a tragic mining accident into something far more deliberate and far more unsettling. To understand what transpired on that remote mountain property in 1858, we must first understand the peculiar dynamics of slavery as it existed in the Appalachian highlands, a system quite different from the plantation economy of the lowland South. We must also understand the unusual partnership between Noah Briggs and Daniel Carter, two men who shared ownership of not only land and mines, but also of the human beings they claimed as property. And most importantly, we must understand Ezekiel Freeman, the man who would become known to history as the last mountain man slave, though the name fails entirely to capture the complexity of the individual who wore it. The mountain regions of western North Carolina in the mid-19th century existed in an uneasy state between two worlds. While not dominated by large plantations like those found in the lower South, the institution of slavery was nonetheless firmly established throughout Appalachia. Court records show that approximately 18% of mountain households owned slaves, with most owning fewer than 5. The practice took on different characteristics in the highlands. Slaves often worked alongside their owners in close quarters, laboring in small-scale agriculture, mining operations, or skilled trades rather than on vast cotton or tobacco fields. Noah Briggs arrived in Watauga County in 1846, having purchased 600 acres of forested land and mineral rights to a promising copper deposit. County records describe him as 34 years of age at the time, a widower from Eastern Virginia with experience in mining operations and a modest inheritance. The following year, he formed a business partnership with Daniel Carter, a 31-year-old bachelor from South Carolina, who brought additional capital and 3 enslaved workers to the enterprise. Together, they established a homestead that soon grew to include a main house, several outbuildings, a small copper mine, and approximately 80 acres of cleared farmland. By 1858, the Briggs-Carter household had grown to include 7 enslaved individuals, 2 adult males, 3 adult females, and 2 children. According to tax records and the meticulous journals kept by Ezekiel Freeman, the enslaved adults performed a variety of functions, from mining and timber work to farming and domestic labor. Freeman himself held a unique position, as both the property caretaker and as Briggs's personal attendant, a position that afforded him unusual mobility and insight into the operation of the household. What makes this case particularly remarkable is the extensive documentation that survives. Most enslaved people were systematically denied literacy, but Ezekiel Freeman, as his journals reveal, had been taught to read and write by Briggs's late wife before her death. After her passing, he continued to maintain detailed accounts of daily life, initially as a way of tracking household expenses and farm yields for his owner, but eventually as a personal record of his experiences. The journals, written in a neat, measured hand on paper taken from Briggs's own study, were hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the small cabin where Freeman slept. "I record these things not for posterity," Freeman wrote in December of 1857, "but so that I might maintain the one thing that remains entirely my own, my memories, my thoughts, the inner workings of a mind they believe incapable of complexity. Perhaps someday someone will read these pages and understand that I was a man, not a tool to be used and discarded." The relationship between Briggs, Carter, and their enslaved workers was complicated by the intimacy of mountain life. Unlike the vast plantations of the lowlands, where owners might rarely interact directly with those they enslaved, the isolated nature of the Appalachian homestead created a suffocating proximity. Briggs and Carter took their meals at the same table where Freeman served them. They worked the same mines, felled trees side by side, and huddled around the same fires during the bitter mountain winters. This proximity created an illusion of familiarity that masked the fundamental power imbalance at the core of their relationship. "Mr. Briggs speaks to me as though I am his confidant," Freeman wrote in one entry dated February 1856. "He tells me of his concerns regarding Mr. Carter's gambling, of his hopes for the mine, of his loneliness since Mrs. Briggs passed. And yet, when I spoke yesterday of my desire to purchase my freedom, his face hardened like mountain granite. 'You ask too much,' he said, 'when I have given you so much already.' As though the ability to read, to move about the property, to sleep in a cabin with a door instead of a dirt floor, were gifts and not merely smaller injustices. The events that would ultimately lead to the deaths of both Briggs and Carter appear to have been set in motion in the autumn of 1857, when Briggs returned from a business trip to Charlotte with troubling news. According to Freeman's journal, the copper market had collapsed, and Briggs had accumulated substantial debts. Over the following months, tensions grew between the two business partners. Carter, who had developed a reputation for reckless gambling in the nearby settlement of Blowing Rock, demanded that they sell some of their enslaved workers to cover their losses. Briggs, according to Freeman's account, initially refused. "Mr. Carter came to dinner in a state of agitation," reads an entry from November 1857. "He insists that Sarah and her children be sold to a trader he met in Morganton who offers a good price. Mr. Briggs objects, saying that he promised Mrs. Briggs before her death that families would not be separated." Their voices grew louder until Mr. Carter threw his glass against the wall. "Sentimentality is a luxury we cannot afford," he shouted. "The mine has failed us. The debts grow. Would you rather lose everything?" The argument was resolved, at least temporarily, when the partners agreed to intensify their mining operation, working longer hours and pushing their enslaved laborers to extract more copper from what was increasingly appearing to be a depleted vein. The winter of 1857–58 was harsh, with heavy snows and bitter cold. The forced labor grew more brutal as desperation set in. "Thomas collapsed in the mine today," Freeman wrote in January 1858. "His lungs, never strong, could not bear the dust and the cold. Mr. Carter had him dragged out and whipped for laziness. I bathed his wounds tonight as best I could, but he burns with fever. I fear he will not see the spring." Thomas, a man in his early 40s who had been with Carter for over 15 years, did indeed die before winter's end. His death marked a turning point in Freeman's journals. The entries, previously measured and observational, took on a darker, more deliberate tone. "I have been contemplating the nature of justice," reads an entry from February 18th, 1858. "Is it just that Thomas lies in an unmarked grave, while Mr. Carter sleeps in a feather bed? Is it just that Sarah trembles at the thought of being sold away from her children? Is it just that despite all my knowledge, all my labor, all my human worth, I remain a piece of property to be disposed of when convenient? I have concluded that justice does not exist in nature. It must be created by men. Sometimes it must be carved out of an unjust world by any means necessary." The following pages detail what can only be described as a methodical plan for escape, not just for Freeman, but for all the enslaved people on the property. Maps of the surrounding mountains were sketched, indicating routes through the wilderness to safe houses rumored to be part of the Underground Railroad. Food caches were established. Freeman even managed to obtain and hide small amounts of money, taken in pennies and nickels from the household accounts over months without detection. But Freeman's plan extended beyond escape. The journals describe in precise detail the design of an elaborate trap centered around the main shaft of the copper mine. Using his knowledge of the pulley systems and support structures, Freeman designed a mechanism that would cause the timber supports to collapse when triggered, sealing the entrance and any unfortunate souls inside. "I do not take this action lightly," he wrote in early March 1858. "I have weighed all other possibilities and found them wanting. Mr. Carter plans to sell Sarah and her children at the spring auction in Morganton. Mr. Briggs, for all his pretense of kindness, has acquiesced. They have left us no choice but to create our own justice." The plan, as detailed in the journal, was executed on March 20th, 1858. Taking advantage of a dispute he had carefully cultivated between the two partners, Freeman arranged for both men to inspect a section of the mine where he claimed to have discovered a new, promising vein of copper. Once both men were deep within the shaft, the trap was sprung. The support beams collapsed, sending tons of rock and earth crashing down, sealing the entrance completely. "It is done," reads the final entry, dated March 21st, 1858. "The others have gone ahead to the meeting point in the rhododendron thicket beyond Grandfather Mountain. I alone remained to ensure that none survived. I heard their cries for hours, growing weaker as the air thinned. Mr. Briggs called my name until his voice gave out. Mr. Carter alternated between offers of freedom and vows of vengeance. Now there is only silence. Tomorrow I join the others on the long journey north. I leave behind these pages as testimony. Not as a confession, for I feel no guilt, but as evidence that even a man branded as property can architect his own liberation. Let those who find these words understand. I was Ezekiel Freeman. I was a slave. I am a slave no longer. The fate of Freeman and the others who escaped with him remains largely unknown. Scattered records suggest that at least some of the group successfully reached Pennsylvania, where a man matching Freeman's description was documented working as a carpenter in Philadelphia in 1862. During the Civil War, enlistment records indicate that he may have joined a colored regiment under the name Ezekiel Justice, though this connection remains speculative. The investigation into the deaths of Briggs and Carter concluded that the mine collapse was a tragic accident, the result of poor maintenance and structural failure. Without Freeman's journals, which remained hidden for over a century, there was no evidence to suggest otherwise. The property was eventually sold to cover the partners' debts, the mine entrance was permanently sealed, and the events of that spring faded from local memory. The journals themselves present a complex moral document. They chronicle the brutality of a system that denied basic humanity to those it enslaved, while also detailing the calculated execution of what modern law would classify as premeditated murder. They force us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, vengeance, and the lengths to which a person might go to secure freedom. When the journals were discovered during the courthouse renovations of 1964, they caused a brief sensation in academic circles, but were quickly suppressed. According to courthouse records, they were initially classified as historically significant documents, but were subsequently removed from public access by order of several prominent local families who claimed relation to the Briggs and Carter lineages. They remained sealed in the state archives until 1982, when a legal challenge by historians succeeded in having them reclassified as public historical documents. Today, the original journals reside in the North Carolina State Archives in Raleigh. Their pages yellow with age, but the ink still clearly legible. The land where the Briggs-Carter homestead once stood has been reclaimed by the forest, with little evidence remaining of the dwellings or the mine that once operated there. Hikers in the area occasionally report finding odd bits of rusted metal or crumbling stone foundations, but the exact location of the mine shaft has been lost to time and deliberate obscurity. The story of Ezekiel Freeman and the fatal trap that buried his enslavers alive serves as a stark reminder of a chapter in Appalachian history that has been frequently overlooked. While the Mountain South is often portrayed as a region where slavery was less prevalent than in the plantation lowlands, the reality was far more complex. The institution existed throughout the highlands, taking on forms that were sometimes less visible, but no less dehumanizing. I have observed that men become accustomed to injustice when it is wrapped in familiarity, Freeman wrote in one of his final entries. They cease to see the wrongness of a thing when it is part of the daily pattern of life. Perhaps this is why Mr. Briggs could speak kindly to me in the morning and deny my humanity in the afternoon. Perhaps this is why Mr. Carter could read his Bible before overseeing a whipping. They had become blind to the contradiction. I, however, see with perfect clarity. In the end, the story of the last mountain man slave is not merely a tale of escape or revenge. It is a complex narrative about the human capacity for both cruelty and resistance, about the moral ambiguities that arise in systems built on fundamental injustice, and about the lengths to which a person might go to reclaim their freedom and dignity. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our shared history, and to recognize that beneath the picturesque beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains lie stories that are far darker and more complex than the regional mythology often suggests. The shaft where Briggs and Carter met their end was sealed not just by rock and earth, but by a conspiracy of silence that sought to bury their story alongside their remains. Yet Freeman's hidden journals ensured that the truth would eventually emerge, like water finding its way through mountain stone, impossible to contain forever. As for the elaborate trap itself, the system of counterweights and trigger mechanisms that brought down the mine shaft, engineers who later studied Freeman's designs noted that they demonstrated an exceptional understanding of structural mechanics and physics. They speculated that Freeman may have received some education in these principles, perhaps from Briggs himself, who had studied engineering briefly at the College of William and Mary. If so, it represents a final, bitter irony, that the knowledge imparted to enslave more efficiently became the tool of ultimate liberation. Today, the forests have reclaimed the land where these events unfolded. The mountains keep their secrets close, revealing them only in fragments, in whispers, in the rustle of leaves and the groaning of ancient trees. But for those who know where to look, who know how to listen, the story of Ezekiel Freeman continues to echo across the ridges and valleys of the Blue Ridge, a reminder that history is always more complex, more human, and often darker than the sanitized versions we prefer to remember. And perhaps, on certain nights when the wind howls down from the mountain peaks, in that remote patch of forest where the old mine once operated, one might still hear the faint, desperate cries of two men trapped beneath the earth, calling the name of the man who sealed their fate and then vanished into the mist-shrouded mountains, carrying with him nothing but the precious burden of his newly claimed freedom. Historians who have studied the case note that the events at the Briggs-Carter property took place against the backdrop of increasing tensions throughout the country. By 1858, the nation stood on the precipice of a conflict that would ultimately resolve the question of slavery through bloodshed. In the Appalachian Mountains, these national divisions were particularly complex. While the majority of mountain residents did not own slaves, those who did often wielded disproportionate economic and political power. Court records from Watauga County indicate that slaveholders controlled approximately 62% of the region's wealth, despite representing less than 20% of the population. It was into this environment of inequality and mounting tension that Ezekiel Freeman plotted what some historians have called the perfect escape. What made Freeman's plan remarkable was not merely its success, but its comprehensive nature. According to interviews conducted in 1937 with elderly residents of the area who claimed to have heard the story from their parents and grandparents, Freeman did not simply flee. He systematically dismantled the economic enterprise that had enslaved him. The old-timers used to say that Freeman poisoned the soil in certain fields before he left, recalled Jonathan Winters, a 93-year-old resident interviewed by researchers from the Federal Writers Project. Not to kill nobody, mind you, but to make sure nothing would grow right for years after. They say he mixed salt and something else into the earth where they planned to plant tobacco that spring. Fields stayed barren for nearly a decade after. While such claims cannot be verified, agricultural records do show that the property, when sold at auction following the deaths of Briggs and Carter, commanded a significantly lower price than comparable parcels in the area. The new owners reportedly struggled to make the land productive, eventually abandoning farming altogether and focusing on timber harvesting instead. Another aspect of Freeman's plan, documented more reliably through banking records preserved in the Watauga County Historical Society archives, involved the partners' finances. In the weeks leading up to the mine collapse, Freeman, who handled many of the household accounts, appears to have systematically misdirected funds, ensuring that several key loan payments were never made. As a result, when Briggs and Carter died, their estate was immediately subject to collection actions by creditors in Charlotte and Raleigh, forcing the hasty liquidation of assets that might otherwise have been inherited by relatives who could have continued to operate the property and potentially pursued the escaped slaves. Freeman understood that true freedom required more than physical escape, wrote Dr. Eleanor Caldwell in her 1978 analysis of the case published in the Journal of Appalachian Studies. He recognized that the economic apparatus of slavery would allow his former owner's heirs to pursue him and the others who fled with him. By ensuring the complete collapse of the Briggs-Carter enterprise, he created a buffer of financial chaos that effectively covered their tracks. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Freeman's plan, as detailed in his journals, was the psychological component. In the months leading up to the escape, he deliberately sowed discord between Briggs and Carter, playing on existing tensions and creating new ones through carefully planted information and misinformation. "I told Mr. Briggs today that I overheard Mr. Carter speaking with a trader about selling Sarah, regardless of their agreement," reads one entry from February 1858. This is not precisely true. Mr. Carter did speak with the trader, but only about the spring tobacco crop. yet Mr. Briggs's face darkened with exactly the suspicion I intended to nurture. The partnership fractures further each day, like ice on a winter pond. By spring, the cracks will be too deep to repair. In another entry he wrote, "I informed Mr. Carter that Mr. Briggs has been keeping separate accounts and understating the mine's production." Mr. Carter immediately went to verify the ledgers, which of course show no such discrepancy. I maintain those books myself, but the seed of doubt has been planted. He will now question every figure, every calculation. Their trust, already fragile, continues to erode. This psychological manipulation created an atmosphere of suspicion that made it easier to lure both men into the mine simultaneously, something that had become increasingly rare as their personal relationship deteriorated. Freeman noted in his final journal entries that he had specifically mentioned a promising new vein that would require both men's expertise to evaluate, knowing that neither would trust the other to assess such a potentially valuable discovery alone. The journals also reveal that Freeman had established contact with a network of free blacks and abolitionists operating in the mountain regions of North Carolina and Tennessee. Entries from late 1857 make oblique references to messages carried by traveling peddlers and information exchanged during infrequent trips to nearby settlements. These connections proved crucial to the escape plan, providing information about routes north and potential safe houses along the way. "The peddler with the red wagon brought news yesterday," reads an entry from December 1857. "3 have made it safely to the Quaker settlement near the Virginia line. The route through Shull's Mill is being watched, but the old Cherokee path remains clear if one knows where to look for the markings." The escape route, as pieced together by historians, likely took Freeman and the others through some of the most rugged terrain in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They would have traveled at night, hiding during daylight hours, following remote paths known primarily to Cherokee hunters and a few white trappers. The journey would have been particularly perilous in early spring, when mountain weather remains unpredictable and streams run high with snowmelt. According to pension records discovered in the National Archives, a man identified as E. Freeman, formerly of North Carolina, applied for a veteran's pension in 1879 in Philadelphia, having served in the 6th United States Colored Infantry during the Civil War. The application mentioned wounds received at the Battle of New Market Heights in Virginia, where many black soldiers distinguished themselves in combat. If this was indeed the same Ezekiel Freeman, it suggests that he not only escaped to freedom, but eventually fought to secure the freedom of others. The fate of the other escapees remains largely unknown, though census records from 1870 do show a woman named Sarah Freeman living in a predominantly black community in southern Ohio with 2 children of appropriate ages. Without surnames or detailed personal information, tracking the movements of formerly enslaved people through historical records remains challenging, as the system of slavery itself sought to erase individual identities. The most complete record we have remains Freeman's own words, preserved in his journals. These writings reveal a man of exceptional intelligence and determination, who maintained his sense of selfhood despite a system designed to strip him of his humanity. They also reveal the moral complexity of his actions, a man who felt driven to commit violence yet documented his reasoning with clarity and precision. "I have reflected long on the Christian teachings Mr. Briggs so often quotes," Freeman wrote in early March of 1858. "An eye for an eye," he recites, "when punishment is administered. And yet, when I contemplate applying that same principle to him, I become the villain in his understanding." This is the contradiction at the heart of their world. Justice for them is injustice for us, and what they call theft, I call reclamation. I take back only what was mine from the beginning, my labor, my body, my freedom. The landscape itself played a crucial role in the events that unfolded at the Briggs-Carter property. The isolation of the mountain homestead, 17 miles from the nearest town of significant size, meant that the enslaved community was largely cut off from the broader social networks that existed in more densely populated areas. It also meant that Freeman and the others who escaped with him had to navigate exceptionally difficult terrain with few established roads or paths. Geographical surveys conducted in the early 1900s indicate that the property was situated in a narrow valley flanked by steep ridges, with the mine shaft dug into the northwestern slope. This topography created natural boundaries that would have made escape difficult under normal circumstances, requiring intimate knowledge of the landscape to find viable routes out of the valley. Freeman's journals suggest that he had spent years mentally mapping these routes during his work, maintaining the property's boundaries. "I have marked the third pine on the ridge above the North Creek," reads an entry from 1856, ostensibly about property maintenance, but clearly part of a longer-term escape plan. From there, one can see both the main house and the gap in the ridge that leads toward the Linville Gorge. When the rhododendron blooms, the path is nearly invisible unless you know to look for the lightning-scarred hemlock that stands sentinel at its entrance. The cultural context of slavery in Appalachia differed in important ways from the plantation system of the lowlands. Enslaved people in mountain communities often worked in closer proximity to their enslavers, sometimes even sharing living quarters during the harsh winter months. This created a different dynamic, one that could be more intimate, yet no less oppressive. Freeman's journals speak repeatedly to the particular cruelty of this false intimacy. Mr. Briggs spoke at length today about his plans to expand the orchard come spring, reads one entry from January 1858. He discussed varieties of apple trees, where they should be planted, how they should be tended, all as though I had some stake in this future he imagines. As though I might one day enjoy the shade of these trees or the sweetness of their fruit. He plans 10 years ahead on land nourished by my sweat, never once considering that I might have plans of my own. This complex relationship extended to the other enslaved people on the property as well. Sarah, who worked primarily in the main house as a cook and housekeeper, was described in Freeman's journals as maintaining a careful performance of contentment to protect her children. "Sarah has perfected the art of invisibility," he wrote in December 1857. "She moves through the house like a shadow, anticipating needs before they are voiced, smiling just enough to avoid accusations of insolence, but never so much as to draw attention. When Mr. Carter or Mr. Briggs are present, her children become similarly ghost-like, knowing instinctively that to be noticed is often to be endangered. Only in the cabin at night, among ourselves, do they laugh and play as children should." The technical aspects of the trap Freeman designed reveal much about both his intelligence and his access to knowledge that enslaved people were typically denied. The mine shaft, where Briggs and Carter met their end, extended approximately 200 feet into the mountainside, with several smaller tunnels branching off from the main passage. The support structure consisted of timber frames placed at regular intervals, with additional reinforcement in areas where the surrounding rock showed signs of instability. Freeman's journals include several detailed sketches of these support structures, along with annotations about their weak points. His plan involved removing several key support beams and replacing them with similar-looking but structurally compromised substitutes that would collapse when a tripwire released a series of wedges holding them in place. The engineering knowledge required for such a design suggests that Freeman had studied the mining operation closely, perhaps even contributing to its design while receiving none of the credit. "Mr. Briggs consulted with me today about reinforcing the eastern tunnel," reads an entry from 1855. "He values my opinion on matters of construction and maintenance, having seen my work on the barn roof last autumn. I suggested a modified support design that he quickly claimed as his own when Mr. Carter inquired. It is a strange existence, to have one's mind valued even as one's humanity is denied. The discovery of Freeman's journals in 1964 created considerable controversy in Watauga County. Several prominent families who claimed descent from the Briggs and Carter lines initially sought to have the documents sealed or destroyed, arguing that they represented an unfair characterization of their ancestors. Other community members, including some local historians, advocated for preserving the journals as an important, if uncomfortable, part of regional history. The debate reached the state legislature, where it became entangled in the broader civil rights movements of the 1960s. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The journals would be preserved in the state archives but would not be displayed publicly or made available for general research without special permission. This restriction remained in place until 1982, when changing attitudes about historical preservation and growing interest in previously suppressed narratives led to the documents being fully accessible to researchers and the public. When finally made available, the journals provided an invaluable window into a perspective rarely documented from the era of slavery. Unlike many slave narratives, which were often transcribed by white abolitionists and potentially altered in the process, Freeman's journals represent his unfiltered thoughts, recorded in his own hand without intermediary interpretation. These documents are exceptional, not just for their content, but for their provenance, wrote Dr. Marcus Jenkins of the University of North Carolina in a 1983 analysis. They represent one of the very few first-person accounts written by an enslaved person in the Appalachian region during the antebellum period. Their preservation is nothing short of miraculous, considering the circumstances of their creation and the many forces that might have led to their destruction. The legacy of Ezekiel Freeman's act continues to be debated by historians and ethicists. Some view it as a justifiable response to an unjust system that provided no legal recourse for those trapped within it. Others point to the premeditated nature of the killings as troubling regardless of context. What remains undisputed is the historical significance of both the events themselves and the documentation Freeman left behind. The physical evidence of this history has largely vanished from the landscape. Aerial surveys conducted in 1971 identified what researchers believed to be the foundations of the main house and several outbuildings, but subsequent ground investigations found little remaining beyond a few scattered stones and the partial outline of a root cellar. The mine entrance itself has never been definitively located, likely collapsed entirely or deliberately obscured in the years following the incident. A small collection of artifacts recovered from the presumed site of the homestead is housed in the Watauga County Historical Museum in Boone. These items include several hand-forged nails, fragments of pottery, a partial horseshoe, and a single copper penny dated 1853. Nothing in this modest collection speaks directly to the dramatic events that unfolded there, yet they provide a tangible connection to the everyday reality in which those events were embedded. In 2003, a proposal was made to erect a historical marker near the presumed location of the Briggs-Carter property, acknowledging both the existence of slavery in the Mountain South and the act of resistance that occurred there. The proposal generated significant local controversy, with some community members arguing that such a marker would inappropriately commemorate an act of violence, while others maintained that ignoring this history perpetuated the erasure of black experiences from the regional narrative. As of this recording, no marker has been placed, though discussions periodically resurface among historical preservation groups. The story of Ezekiel Freeman and the fatal trap he engineered represents more than just a sensational tale of revenge. It offers insight into the complex moral universe of those living under slavery, the particular nature of Appalachian slavery with its close quarters and false intimacies, and the extraordinary measures some were driven to in their quest for freedom. It stands as a corrective to simplified narratives about mountain communities being largely untouched by the institution of slavery or somehow more benign in their practice of it. "I do not expect understanding from those who find these words," Freeman wrote in his final journal entry. "I expect judgment, for judgment comes easily to those who have never faced the choice between submission and rebellion. But know this, I did not begin this violence. I merely redirected what was already present, flowing like an underground river beneath the surface of our daily interactions. The violence began the moment human beings were claimed as property, and it continued with every denied request, every threatened sale, every separation of family, every wielding of the master's authority. I merely brought this violence into the light, gave it form and purpose, and turned it back upon its source. Today, the mountains of western North Carolina continue to draw visitors with their natural beauty and rich cultural heritage. Tourists hike the same ridgelines that Freeman and his fellow escapees traversed in their journey to freedom, often unaware of the complex human dramas that unfolded beneath these ancient trees. The story of the last mountain man slave reminds us that landscapes carry histories far more complicated than their postcard appearances might suggest. As for Ezekiel Freeman himself, if he indeed survived to see the end of slavery, as the pension records suggest, he would have witnessed a transformation of American society that must have seemed unimaginable during his years of captivity. The country that once classified him as property eventually called upon him and other black men to fight for its preservation, offering citizenship in return, a citizenship that would remain incomplete for generations to come. His journals end with his escape from the mountain homestead, but one can imagine that the man who planned so meticulously, who observed so carefully, and who wrote so eloquently would have continued to document his experiences. If such later writings exist, they have yet to be discovered. Like so much of African American history, particularly in the Appalachian region, fragments remain while much has been lost to time, deliberate suppression, or simple neglect. What survives, however, is powerful testimony to the complexity of the human spirit, its capacity for endurance, its hunger for freedom, and its ability to find agency even in the most constrained circumstances. The story of Ezekiel Freeman challenges us to look beyond comfortable historical narratives, to acknowledge the darker aspects of our shared past, and to recognize the profound moral questions that continue to echo through time like the distant rumble of a mountain mine collapse, sudden, devastating, and impossible to ignore once heard. Visitors to the Blue Ridge Parkway, which passes not far from where these events took place, often pull over at overlooks to admire the seemingly endless waves of mountains rolling toward the horizon. They photograph the mist rising from valleys, the brilliant autumn foliage, the wildflowers carpeting spring meadows. Few realize that beneath this beauty lies a landscape equally shaped by human hands and human struggles, by the labor of enslaved people like Ezekiel Freeman, by the economic ambitions of men like Briggs and Carter, and by countless acts of resistance, both large and small, that have rarely made their way into official histories. The true power of Freeman's story lies not in its exceptional nature, but in how it illuminates aspects of Appalachian history that have too often been overlooked. For every documented case like his, countless others have been lost to time or deliberately erased from public memory. In the end, perhaps the most fitting memorial to Ezekiel Freeman is not a physical marker, but the ongoing effort to recover and preserve the complex history of African Americans in Appalachia. A history in which his voice, preserved through his own written words, continues to speak with remarkable clarity across the centuries, reminding us that the pursuit of freedom has taken many forms, some of them difficult to reconcile with modern sensibilities, but all of them testifying to the fundamental human desire for self-determination that no system of bondage could ever fully extinguish. By engaging with this difficult history, we honor not only Freeman's extraordinary bid for freedom, but also the countless unnamed others who resisted, survived, and ultimately helped shape the region in ways that deserve recognition and remembrance. The trap that buried Noah Briggs and Daniel Carter alive in the spring of 1858 has long since been sealed by time and earth. But the questions it raises about justice, resistance, and the human capacity for both cruelty and courage remain as relevant today as they were more than a century and a half ago, continuing to echo through these ancient mountains like a voice that refuses to be silenced.